There are 20 pedestals in the Imperial Palace on Terra. 18 of them hold statues. Some are cracked, some defaced, some repaired badly and left in that half-ruined state, as if the people who defaced them had a point worth preserving even in their act of vandalism. A few glow with the quiet reverence of a civilization that does not easily let go of its heroes. These 18 pedestals mark the sons of the Emperor, the demigod warriors who either stood with humanity through its darkest hours or betrayed it when betrayal mattered most. 2 pedestals are empty, not damaged, not toppled, not in need of repair. Empty, completely bare. No names engraved in the stone beneath them, no inscriptions. No faded marks where a chisel once met marble and left the ghost of a name. Nothing at all. Just smooth, cold stone that has stood vacant for over 10,000 years, and if certain forces have their way, will remain vacant forever. Those 2 empty pedestals are the subject of this video. They represent 2 of the 20 Primarchs the Emperor created during the earliest, most violent chapter of the Imperium's birth. 2 sons, 2 legions of space marines, 2 entire chapters of history that were not merely lost, not merely suppressed, but actively, deliberately, surgically removed from the record of human civilization. Someone with enormous power decided these men and everything they did should be treated as though they never existed at all. And then they made it happen. They scrubbed the records. They pulled down the statues. They redistributed the soldiers. They altered the memories of the people who had known these Primarchs personally. People like Rogel Dorn and Magnus the Red. People whose minds were so powerful they could crush tanks with a thought. And yet even they found themselves struggling to recall the faces of brothers they had stood beside in battle. What could make the Imperium do something like that? What could be so terrible, so threatening, so fundamentally incompatible with the story the Emperor wanted humanity to tell about itself, that even the other Primarchs had to have their memories rewritten? That is the question we are going to sit with tonight. Get comfortable. Let whatever you have on in the background settle into something quieter. This is one of those lore deep dives that rewards patience, the kind where the longer you sit with the mystery, the heavier it gets, and the more you realize that the weight itself is the point. Section 1. How 20 demigods were born. To understand why 2 Primarchs could be erased, you first need to understand what a Primarch actually is and why their existence mattered so much that losing even one of them was considered a catastrophe of the highest order. The Emperor of Mankind is not a simple figure. He is not a general or a king, or even what we would normally call a god, though plenty of people in the far future call him that anyway. He is something older and stranger, a being of immense psychic power who has walked the earth since before recorded history, surviving through willpower and reincarnation and purposes so vast and long-ranging that normal human minds cannot hold them comfortably. He spent thousands of years watching civilizations rise and collapse, making small interventions here and there, learning, accumulating a picture of where humanity needed to go if it was going to survive what was coming from the warp. And then, during the chaos and darkness of what historians call the Age of Strife, he decided it was time to stop watching and start acting. His plan was the Great Crusade. He would unify humanity under a single banner, reclaim the stars that mankind had lost during centuries of war and warp storms and alien predation, and build something that could actually survive the darkness pressing in from every direction. But to do that, he needed commanders, not regular humans. Even enhanced, even brilliant, even the most exceptional generals the species had ever produced would not be enough. He needed something more than exceptional. He needed beings who were, by definition, beyond the range of ordinary human excellence. So, in secret laboratories, carved deep beneath the mountain range we would now call the Himalayas, beneath what would eventually become the Imperial Palace on Terra, the Emperor began the most ambitious genetic project in human history. He used his own DNA as the foundation. He used science that the Imperium would later call forbidden and burn people for even possessing. He used, according to some accounts buried in restricted texts, knowledge he had bargained for from sources he would never name, including forces from within the warp itself, the turbulent psychic dimension that underlies reality and feeds on human emotion and ambition. Some records suggest a perpetual named Erda served as the biological mother of the Primarchs, combining her genetic material with the Emperor's to create something neither one of them could have produced alone. And from all of this, across years of careful and dangerous work, with the brightest minds his civilization could produce, the Emperor created 20 superhuman infants in gestation pods. Each one was a masterwork of biological engineering. Each one carried within them a fragment of everything the Emperor was, concentrated and refined and shaped to serve a specific purpose in the coming campaign. These were the Primarchs. Each one was designed to be different, not in defect, but in emphasis. The Emperor understood that leading a galaxy-wide civilization requires a spectrum of qualities that no single being can embody completely. You need the brilliant tactician and the inspiring orator, the diplomatic genius and the terrifying enforcer, the compassionate healer and the relentless berserker, the builder who raises walls and the destroyer who tears them down, the scholar who hoards knowledge and the soldier who applies it without hesitation. So each Primarch embodied a different cluster of the Emperor's own traits, pushed to their extreme, refined and concentrated, until it became the defining quality of a living demigod. Robert Guillemot received an almost supernatural talent for organization and administration, the ability to look at a chaotic system and see not just how to impose order on it, but how to build something elegant enough to sustain itself across centuries. Sanguinius inherited beauty and compassion so profound, it moved people to tears, an emotional luminosity that made even hardened warriors want to be better in his presence. Leman Russ got ferocity and loyalty, and the wolf's instinct for which members of the pack needed protecting and which threats needed to be eliminated immediately and completely. Perturabo received a mind for fortification and siege warfare so precise he could calculate structural weaknesses in any wall within seconds of examining it. Magnus got psychic power of a scale that dwarfed most of his brothers, paired with the burning, dangerous curiosity to use that power in ways nobody else dared. Each was a masterwork. Each was a piece of the whole, a sun shaped for a specific purpose within a larger design. And together, the 20 were meant to be unbeatable. An army with 20 perfect generals, each leading legions of enhanced warriors, bred from their own genetics, could conquer anything, and they very nearly did. But the Chaos Gods had other ideas. The four great entities of the warp, beings who feed on human emotion and thrive on conflict and suffering, saw the Primarchs for what they were. Not just powerful beings, but threats. The Emperor's plan, if completed, would potentially give humanity the power to resist the Chaos Gods in ways that could threaten their hold on the warp itself and on the human populations they fed upon. So they intervened, at the most vulnerable possible moment, before the Primarchs had been born. A great warp storm tore through the Emperor's labs, ripping 20 gestation pods away from their carefully maintained environment, dragging them through the swirling psychic chaos of the immaterium, and scattering them across the galaxy like seeds thrown to a wind that blows in directions human minds cannot follow. Each pod landed on a different world. Each infant Primarch grew up in an alien environment, shaped by its particular hardships and its gifts and its cruelties. Some landed on worlds with functioning civilizations that recognized what they had found and raised these extraordinary children as heroes or champions. Some landed on nightmare worlds, where they had to survive alone against monsters before they were old enough to walk, where the only available lessons were the lessons of violence and endurance. The touch of the warp during that journey through the immaterium marked all of them in ways the Emperor had never intended, planting seeds of weakness and glory in equal measure. Some of those seeds would not bloom for 10,000 years. Some have not bloomed yet. The Emperor, left without his greatest creations, did not collapse or give up. He had preserved genetic material from each Primarch before they were taken. From that material, he engineered the gene seed, biological implants that, when placed in a young male human host, would gradually transform that host into something approaching a Primarch's level of physical capability. These hosts were the first Space Marines, 20 legions of them, each one carrying the genetics of one missing Primarch, each waiting for the day their gene father was found and could take command of the warriors grown from his own biology. The Great Crusade began without the Primarchs, and then, one by one, the Emperor found them. Each reunion was a landmark moment. The emperor arriving at a distant world to find his son had already made himself a conqueror or a king or a legend, and presenting that son with his legion for the first time. Some Primarchs wept at the sight of the warriors made from their own body. Some were suspicious. Some were furious at the circumstances of their creation and abandonment. Some simply got to work. Every one of those meetings is a story worth telling on its own, but 2 of those meetings remain blank in the record. 2 of the 20 Primarchs were found. The lore makes clear that all 20 were eventually located, and yet their meetings with the Emperor left no records behind. Their reunion with their legions left no records behind. Their service during the Great Crusade left almost no records behind. Not because nothing happened, not because they were overlooked or quiet or unimportant, but because someone made sure the records would not survive. This is where the mystery begins. Section 2. What the records do and do not say. If you go looking for the 2nd and 11th Primarchs in official Warhammer lore, you will find an absence shaped so precisely that its edges glow. The absence itself has a form, and that form, once you learn to read it, tells you a great deal about what was taken away. Start with the most direct evidence, the published books themselves. The Horus Heresy series, the massive decades-spanning prose epic, published by Black Library, that chronicles the fall of the Imperium, contains a table in its companion volumes listing every Space Marine Legion by number, name, and the name of their Primarch. For the 2nd and 11th Legions, those entries have been redacted, not left blank, as they would be if the information had simply never been recorded. Redacted. Black bars drawn across the names, exactly as a classified document would be censored before public release. This is a deliberate artistic and thematic choice designed to show you that these names existed, that they were written down once, and that someone with authority over the historical record decided they should not be readable anymore. Those black bars are interesting in a specific way the fandom has spent years analyzing. They have length. The redaction bar covering the 2nd Legion's name is quite long, nearly as long as the name Emperor's Children, giving you a rough sense of syllable count. The bar covering the 2nd Primarch's personal name is shorter, close to the length of the single name Alfarius. This suggests, very tentatively, that the 2nd Primarch might have had a relatively short name, possibly a single-word designation. This is a fragment too small to draw firm conclusions from, but it is a clue. Someone left the bars with these lengths, and whether that was intentional or accidental, the measurement is there. Then there is the novel Prospero Burns by Dan Abnett, which follows a human scholar named Kaspar Hauser as he becomes embedded with the Space Wolves Legion. In the 13th chapter, Hauser says plainly that he knows the locations of the fortress monasteries of 18 Space Marine Legions. 18. At the time of that story, during the years immediately preceding the Horus Heresy, 18 is the number, not 20. The 2 missing legions had already ceased to exist during what was supposed to be the Golden Age. In the novel Deliverance Lost, the Primarch Corax is meeting the Emperor for the first time. He asks about the other Primarchs, because he is designated Primarch 19, and the Emperor tells him there are 17 others. 17. Corax is confused by the arithmetic. When he pushes, the Emperor's face goes bleak, filled with deep sorrow, the novel says. Sorrow. Not anger, not the defensive formality of a leader with classified information, not the brisk dismissal of someone too busy for inconvenient questions. Sorrow. A being who does not struggle to explain complicated things to complicated minds chose, in that moment, to give nothing. He says only that some are lost, and that is all. The novel The First Heretic contains one of the most significant conversations in the entire mystery. Magnus the Red and Lorgar, 2 Primarchs speaking in a rare moment of genuine candor, discuss the 2 missing brothers. They reference their deaths, specifically their deaths, as having occurred approximately 43 years before the Drop Site Massacre at Istvan V. This is crucial because earlier editions of some codices had suggested the lost legions might have fought for Horus at the start of the heresy. The First Heretic contradicts that, directly. These Primarchs were gone long before Horus raised his banner. Whatever happened to them happened during the Golden Age, when the Great Crusade was still ongoing, and everyone still believed everything was going to be fine. The novel A Thousand Suns gives us another fragment, quiet and easy to miss. During the triumph of Ulanor, the celebration marking what the Imperium believed was its greatest victory, Magnus is standing with Mortarion and begins a sentence about how remarkable it is that so many brothers are gathered in one place, something that has not happened since. And then he stops himself. He trails off. He recognizes he was about to say something he should not say, about an older gathering that would have included the two missing ones, and he catches himself and chooses silence instead. Even in casual conversation between brothers, at a moment of triumph, the lost Primarchs were something you found yourself beginning to mention before pulling back. In the novel Fear to Tread, which follows Sanguinius, there is a conversation between him and Horus that operates as a warning, even though neither man says it directly. Sanguinius has a dark secret. The Blood Angels carry a curse called the Red Thirst that could mark them for destruction if the Emperor ever discovered it. He refuses to tell the Emperor about this flaw despite Horus pressing him. When Horus asks why he has kept it hidden, Sanguinius becomes sharp and says he will not be responsible for a third empty plinth under the hegemon's roof. A third empty plinth. Sanguinius feared that revealing a flaw in his legion would get him and his warriors erased from history, the same way the 2nd and 11th were erased. That fear, that raw personal terror from one of the most powerful beings alive, tells you everything about the reputation those disappearances had among the brothers. They were cautionary tales. They were warnings that something specific and terrible could happen to a legion and its Primarch, and that the result was not death but erasure. And erasure, apparently, was worse. Then there is Rogel Dorn, in the short story The Lightning Tower. He walks through the Imperial Palace, past a row of pillars topped with life-size statues of his brothers. He comes to the 2nd plinth and the 11th. Both are vacant. He notes that they had been vacant for a long time. No one ever spoke of those two absent brothers. He calls their absence their separate tragedies, not betrayals, not crimes, not disgraces. Tragedies. And he wonders whether those tragedies were warnings that went unheeded. He was right. They were. Drop a comment right now, telling me where you are in the world and what time it is there. I want to know who is out there sitting with this mystery alongside me. Midnight in a city you did not expect to be in tonight? 3 in the afternoon with a storm coming? Wherever you are, drop it below. And if you have not subscribed yet, now would be a genuinely good time. There is so much more of this to explore. Section 3. The Weight of Forgotten and Purged. The two lost Primarchs are referred to in surviving lore by two specific labels, the Forgotten and the Purged. Those words are not interchangeable. They are not synonyms. In a setting as deliberately constructed as Warhammer 40,000, where every piece of language carries weight and every name was chosen with awareness of what it implies, the difference between Forgotten and Purged is categorical rather than aesthetic. It tells you that two different things happen to two different beings, and understanding the distinction is one of the more important tools you have for constructing any picture of what actually occurred. To forget someone is to allow them to pass from memory. There is a passivity to it, a sadness. Something is lost, and the loss is acknowledged even when the memory is no longer intact. The word carries within it an implication of something that was permitted to fade rather than violently destroyed. The Forgotten Primarch, the one associated with the 2nd Legion, was subjected to a specific kind of erasure that carries this quality of passive allowance rather than active punishment. Their records were removed, yes. Their statues were taken down, yes. But the label applied to them, and the way the surviving lore treats their absence, suggests something softer than what was done to the other. An erasure born of painful necessity rather than righteous condemnation. Some accounts note that the records for the 2nd Legion are sometimes described not as censored, but as file not found, as though the erasure was so thorough it left not even the shape of what was removed, as though whoever did this had practice and was careful about it. To purge something is an active, violent, deliberate act. You purge a wound of infection. You purge a record of unacceptable content. You purge a legion of warriors who have become something that cannot be permitted to exist. The purged, the 11th Legion and its Primarch, were not quietly filed away. Something in their story required active destruction rather than passive erasure. The Adeptus Custodes, the emperor's own elite bodyguard, who rarely involve themselves in anything below the level of civilization-defining events, are recorded in the lore as having been among the first respondents to an act of betrayal involving the 11th Legion. Respondents. That word implies urgency. They were sent running, the golden warriors of the emperor's personal guard, dispatched with the kind of immediate priority that suggests whatever happened required their specific capability applied quickly. The Space Wolves also appear in the shadows of this story. They served as the Emperor's instruments of punishment across the Great Crusade, dispatched to break legions that misbehaved, to enforce the Emperor's will when polite requests had exhausted their usefulness. Leman Russ carried the title of Emperor's Executioner, not as hyperbole, but as a literal description of his function. And in one offhand comment preserved in the lore, Russ suggests his legion was involved in the fate of at least one of the missing ones. He does not elaborate. He rarely does about the things that weigh most heavily on him. So even the labels carry information about what actually happened. Forgotten implies something was permitted to pass into silence, with a quality of grief rather than anger. Purged implies something was actively destroyed, with a quality of terrible necessity. Two different fates for two different Primarchs. Two different stories that happen to share only their outcome of erasure. The formal mechanism of that erasure has a name in the lore. It is called an Edict of Obliteration. The High Gothic term is Damnatio Memoriae, which translates directly as condemnation of memory. It is the Imperium's most extreme form of institutional punishment, not death, not imprisonment, not exile, but the systematic removal of an individual from the record of history itself. All images are destroyed. All names are struck from every document that can be found and reached. All monuments are dismantled, the materials repurposed or destroyed, so that even the physical substance of the tribute cannot be recovered and reassembled. Speaking of the condemned becomes forbidden. The goal is not merely to punish the person, but to make it as though they never existed at all, so that their influence and their ideas and their legacy cannot spread or inspire or contaminate future generations who might have agreed with them. The Romans practiced a version of this, and the Imperium borrows so heavily from Rome's aesthetic and institutional vocabulary that this connection is neither subtle nor accidental. In Rome, damnatio memoriae was applied to disgraced emperors after their deaths. Their faces were carefully carved off statues and replaced with the face of someone more acceptable. Their names were chiseled out of inscriptions with such precision that you can still see the scars in surviving stonework 2,000 years later. Their official acts were sometimes legally nullified as though they had never passed. It was a way of saying, this person has no place in the story our civilization tells about itself. But here is the paradox that the Warhammer writers understood clearly when they built this into the setting. A truly effective damnatio memoriae is almost impossible to achieve completely. The very act of erasing someone leaves traces. You can remove a name from a document, but you cannot remove the gap where the name used to be, and the gap has the shape of what was taken. You can pull down a statue, but you cannot remove the plinth it stood on, and an empty plinth in a row of occupied ones is its own kind of monument. You can alter the memories of soldiers and clerks and administrators, but you cannot do it so precisely that nobody ever notices something has been altered, and once someone notices, the alteration is itself evidence. The two empty pedestals in the Imperial Palace are not nothing. They are the loudest possible statement that something once stood there and was deliberately, officially, permanently removed. They are a 10,000-year-old scar that the Imperium has not been able to make invisible despite centuries of effort. And somehow, through all of that effort, the fact that two Primarchs existed still made it through the millennia. The numbers in the records are wrong, and anyone with the right context can see it. The plinths are empty, and anyone who walks through the relevant corridors can see them. The novels contain fragments that slipped past censors or were recorded before they arrived. And in a document called the Imperial Infantryman's Uplifting Primer, a practical military guide distributed to ordinary soldiers of the Astra Militarum, a reference to the 2nd and 11th Legions was accidentally printed and shipped before anyone caught the error. A tiny crack in a dam that has held for 10 millennia, and through that crack, a fragment of truth. They existed, they fought, they were real, and then they were erased. Section 4. Every breadcrumb in the dark. The lore contains many breadcrumbs about the lost Primarchs. Not abundant breadcrumbs. The fragments are sparse and scattered, but the ones that do exist have been analyzed so obsessively by the fan community over decades of collective attention that every implication has been mapped. Let us work through them carefully. Each one has something to say, and the patience it takes to hear them all together is worthwhile. The most dramatic single piece of evidence is Horus's vision in the novel False Gods. Horus has been wounded by a chaos weapon on the moon of a world called Davin, and while he lies in a coma, being manipulated by forces that want to turn him against the Emperor, he experiences a warp-induced vision that sends him back in time to the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayas. He walks through the vault where the 20 Primarchs were created. He passes the pods, each one representing a potential human destiny being grown in accelerated suspension. And when he reaches the pod marked 11, he stops. He stops and he feels. The novel describes him sensing the untapped glories that might have lain ahead for what grew within that pod, while simultaneously knowing they would never come to pass. He places his hand on the container and holds it there for a long moment, and then his anger, the chaos-fueled rage that is already beginning to reshape who he is, takes over, and he strikes the pod with his fist, damaging it. He physically attacks the containment unit of a brother who, at the moment of that vision, has not yet even been born. This is extraordinary for several reasons. It confirms that whatever happened to Primarch 11, it was something Horus found deeply and personally affecting. He was the first Primarch found, the most beloved son, the being who would be named War Master over all his brothers. If he stood before that pod and felt grief, it was real grief. The grief of someone who lost something that mattered. His anger at the pod itself suggests that the fate of Primarch 11 was associated in his mind with loss and waste, and something going wrong that should have gone right. And the vision being set in the lab before the scattering suggests that whatever connection Horus felt to Primarch 11 existed at a level that predated conscious experience. It was written in the genetics, in the shared origin of two beings grown in the same vault for the same purpose. The Corax conversation deserves careful examination. When Corax asks the Emperor why the numbers do not add up, why there are only 17 other Primarchs, if he himself is designated Primarch 19, the Emperor's face goes bleak, filled with deep sorrow, not anger, not the defensive formality of a leader with classified information, not the brisk dismissal of someone too busy for inconvenient questions. Sorrow. The Emperor, a being so vast and so controlled that his emotions are rarely visible at all, shows genuine sorrow when the subject is raised. He says only that some are lost, and that is all. Malcador the Sigillite is more specific in a different passage. When Rogel Dorn raises the subject of the missing brothers and presses for information, Malcador says they are lost to us forever. Forever is a very precise word in that context. Not dead, not imprisoned, not being dealt with in ways that might someday be reversed. Lost. Forever. As if the matter has been resolved in a way that admits of no recovery, as if the door has been shut permanently and no one is ever going to open it for any reason, regardless of what changes. The conversation between Magnus and Lorgar in the First Heretic is perhaps the clearest timeline anchor the lore provides. Magnus says the lost Primarchs and their legions died approximately 43 years before the Drop Site Massacre at Istvan V. Counting back from that event puts the disappearance of Legions 2 and 11 in the 860s of M30. That timing is not coincidental. It places the event during, or very shortly after, one of the most catastrophic and least discussed conflicts in Warhammer history. Then there is the most significant single text connected to this mystery, the short story called The Chamber at the End of Memory, written by James Swallow and published in an anthology called Scions of the Emperor. By broad consensus among serious lore enthusiasts, this is the most important thing ever officially published about the lost Primarchs. It is also infuriating in the specific way that the best mysteries are infuriating. It tells you enough to make the not knowing worse. The story follows Rogel Dorn. During a visit to a chamber deep within the Imperial Palace, a room connected to the Sigillite's work that nobody visits anymore, Dorn discovers something about his own memory. He realizes with crawling horror that he cannot properly recall the faces of his two missing brothers. He knows they existed. He has the abstract knowledge that there were 20 Primarchs, and 2 of them are absent. But when he tries to remember them specifically, their names, their faces, the sound of their voices, the specific battles they fought beside him, the memories slip. Not like normal forgetting, like something has been done to the memories, like they have been altered by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. He confronts Malcador, and Malcador admits it. Yes, the memories of everyone who knew the lost Primarchs have been altered, not just regular humans and ordinary space marines. The Primarchs themselves have had portions of their memories surgically removed. Beings with the most powerful minds in human history have been opened up and had things taken out. And the surgery was precise enough that they did not notice. Because how do you notice that something has been taken when the memory of having it is what was taken? Dorn asks to have his memories restored, at least temporarily. He wants to know what happened, and Malcador grants this. For a brief period, Rogal Dorn, one of the most stoic and controlled Primarchs ever written, remembers what happened to Legions 2 and 11. The story does not tell us what he sees. It withholds the content of the memory with deliberate, excruciating precision, but it tells us how Dorn reacts. He says what happened to those 2 legions was worse than the Horus Heresy, worse than the civil war that killed 2 Primarchs in battle and reduced the Emperor himself to a dying shell on a golden throne. The war that destroyed entire star systems and turned 9 legions of space marines into servants of chaos and shattered the Imperium so completely that 10,000 years later, it still has not fully recovered. Something that happened during the Golden Age was worse, and it was bad enough that Dorn does not decide to carry the knowledge forward. He does not decide the Imperium deserves to know this truth. He asks Malcador to take the memory back. He chooses ignorance over knowledge, permanently and willingly. And Rogal Dorn is not a man who chooses ignorance over anything. Section 5. The Rangdan Xenocides. The timing that Magnus and Lorgar give us, the 860s of M30, points with uncomfortable precision at a conflict that the Imperium has also tried hard to minimize and obscure, the Rangdan Xenocides. The Rangda were a species of alien, that much is confirmed. Beyond that, almost everything about them is classified, contradicted by competing sources, or buried under layers of deliberate vagueness. What the surviving lore does say is that sometime around 839 of M30, as the Great Crusade pushed into the northern reaches of the galaxy and began encountering species it had never catalogued, Imperial forces encountered the Rangda. And the Rangda were not just powerful, they were existentially dangerous in a way the Imperium had never previously faced. The records that survive describe whole expeditionary fleets being destroyed without a single survivor, not defeated, annihilated, with nothing making it back to report what happened. Dozens of Titan legions were obliterated across the campaign. Entire Space Marine legions were damaged so severely that their ability to function as coherent forces was threatened. The Dark Angels lost thousands of warriors. The Space Wolves were pushed to functional near collapse. The Death Guard suffered so grievously that they had to recruit non-Barbaran warriors, breaking their own strict cultural traditions about where their soldiers came from, just to keep their numbers viable. More than 80,000 Space Marines died across the Rangdan Xenocides, 80,000 superhuman warriors, and alongside them, an uncounted number of regular Imperial Army soldiers, a number so large the records do not attempt to specify it. Entire human worlds were burned or lost. The scope was, according to those few historians who know the Xenocides happened at all, comparable to the Horus Heresy itself, the same Horus Heresy that is treated as the single greatest catastrophe in human history, might have had a predecessor of comparable scale during the Golden Age of the Crusade, and almost nobody knows. Why does almost nobody know? Partly because the records were classified at levels most Imperial scholars cannot access. Partly because the Imperium prefers its citizens believe their civilization was built on unbroken victories. But also, very specifically, because the 2 legions that fought most centrally in the Xenocides were the 2 legions whose records were subsequently erased. The slip in the Imperial infantryman's uplifting primer confirms the connection. That accidental inclusion of classified material names the 2nd and 11th Legions as participants in the Rangdan Xenocides campaigns, deployed alongside solar auxilia elements to fight the Rangda. No details. No descriptions of what they did or what happened to them. Just the names and the shadow of involvement in something that someone later decided needed to be invisible. The timing aligns with devastating precision. The Xenocides ran through the 860s of M30. Magnus and Lorgar put the deaths of the lost Primarchs in the 860s of M30. The Space Wolves fought in the Rangdan Xenocides and are hinted to have been involved in the fate of the missing legions. The Custodes were first respondents to the 11th Legion's betrayal. The Rangda, according to fragments of lore and restricted sources, were not merely physically powerful. They had abilities that operated on the minds of their opponents. Some accounts describe them as possessing capabilities that influenced or corrupted large groups of enemies, turning their thinking in directions that served the Rangda. If those accounts are accurate, they raise a terrible possibility. What if the Rangda did not just kill the soldiers of the 2nd and 11th Legions? What if they affected them, altered them, turned Primarchs who began the campaign as loyal sons of the Emperor into something that, by its end, could no longer be trusted? The Custodes being dispatched would make terrible sense under that framework. You do not send the Emperor's personal bodyguard to handle an ordinary mutiny. You send them when the threat is to the Emperor's own project, his own family, his own carefully constructed plan. If 2 Primarchs and their warriors had been compromised in ways that made them dangerous, not to their enemies but to the Imperium itself, transformed into weapons pointed at the wrong targets, then erasure would not be punishment. It would be necessity. What gives this theory additional weight is what happened to the Ultramarines around this same period. By the time of the Horus Heresy, the Ultramarines were the largest legion by a significant margin, despite not having been among the first to reach full strength. Their numbers had grown dramatically during the period of the Rangdan Xenocides and its aftermath. If the warriors of the 2nd and 11th Legions were, after the deaths of their Primarchs, mind-wiped and quietly redistributed rather than simply disbanded or executed, if Dorn and Guilliman persuaded Malcador to spare the soldiers even as the Primarchs were dealt with, then the Ultramarines' suspicious numerical growth has a straightforward explanation. They absorbed the survivors of 2 erased legions, warriors who did not know where they came from, carrying within their gene seed the biology of Primarchs whose names would never be spoken again. The most orthodox and thoroughly documented legion in the history of the Imperium might be carrying, in its bloodline, the genetic children of the 2 sons the Emperor could not save. Section 6. The Emperor's Executioners. Before we examine the theories in full, we need to return to Leman Russ, because his role in this story is perhaps the strangest and most uncomfortable of all, and it says something about the Space Wolves that their culture has spent 10,000 years carefully not saying. Leman Russ was known during his lifetime by a title. His successors, remember, with pride and discomfort, braided together so tightly you cannot separate them. The Emperor's Executioner. He was not merely a warrior or a general or a conqueror, though he was all of those things with frightening excellence. He was the being the Emperor called when someone needed to be punished in ways that went beyond legal procedure or political pressure. He broke Angron's control over the World Eaters during the Night of the Wolf. He attacked the Thousand Sons on Archreach Secundus over a disagreement about psychic powers. He destroyed Prospero, the home world of Magnus the Red, on direct imperial orders, and then spent the rest of his existence wrestling with whether that order had been righteous or manipulated. In the Lexicanum, the community-maintained encyclopedia of 40K lore, there is a line almost buried in a long list of Space Wolves campaigns and events. It notes that the Space Wolves, serving as the Emperor's executioners, may have had something to do with the disappearance of the 2 lost legions. And separately, according to members of the Adeptus Custodes, the Space Wolves were among the first respondents to an act of betrayal involving the 11th Legion, first respondents alongside the Custodes. When 2 of the most elite military forces in the history of the Imperium are both described as first responders to the same event, that event was not minor. It was not a disciplinary matter or a political disagreement. It was something that required the immediate application of both overwhelming force and absolute institutional authority at the same time. Russ himself, in that single preserved offhand comment in the lore, indicates his legion was involved in the destruction of the two lost legions. He says it the way someone mentions a thing they have long since decided they would never fully make peace with, but have stopped expecting peace from. He does not seem proud. He does not seem ashamed. He says it the way a soldier mentions a war that ended in a way nobody can feel good about, factually, without elaboration, with a weight in the words that suggests the full story is not one he tells casually. Imagine what that was. Imagine being Lemon Russ and being given an order to go and destroy two other Primarchs. Not chaos-corrupted Primarchs, toward whom you already had personal enmity. Not creatures that had already shown themselves to be enemies, your brothers. Brothers who, by the most charitable interpretation of the lore, had been victims of something external, rather than willing architects of their own corruption. The Space Wolves executed that order, and then they lived with having executed it. They wore the title of Emperor's Executioner without apology, but the weight of what that title meant, what it had required of them in the deepest and most private sense, is there in the lore if you look for it. The chamber at the end of memory gives us the aftermath, through Dorn's experience. Malcador confirms that every being who had contact with the lost Primarchs was subjected to memory modification, including the Primarchs themselves. You modify memories when the content of those memories is itself dangerous, when knowing what happened could spread something, an idea, or a capability, or a piece of knowledge, that you cannot allow to circulate freely. The Imperium did not just want people to stop talking about the lost Primarchs. It wanted people to be physically incapable of remembering them, with enough clarity to describe what they had done. That is not the behavior of an institution covering up an embarrassment. That is the behavior of an institution sealing off something genuinely infectious. Section 7. The theories in full. Here is where we synthesize everything the lore gives us and examine the major theories the fan community has developed over decades of careful, obsessive, loving attention to every fragment and implication. None of these is confirmed. All of them are worth taking seriously. The Rangdan corruption theory. This is arguably the most popular theory among serious lore enthusiasts, and it has the most circumstantial support from canonical material. The timing matches. The involvement of the Space Wolves as executioners and the Custodes as first respondents matches the scale of response that corruption at the Primarch level would require. The memory modification matches how the Imperium handles things it considers memetically dangerous, things that could corrupt simply through being known. Under this theory, the Rangda's mental abilities operated on the Primarchs of the 2nd and 11th Legions in ways that could not be resisted or reversed. Not because those Primarchs were weak, but because the Rangda had evolved specifically to penetrate exactly the kind of psychic fortification Primarchs possessed, had encountered their type before, had already developed the tool for the job before anyone in the Imperium knew those tools existed. The Rangda might have been the galaxy's most expert hunters of apex psychic beings, and the Primarchs, for all their power, were exactly what the Rangda knew how to take apart. The result would have been two of the Emperor's sons, transformed by alien influence into weapons pointed at the Imperium. Not chaos corrupted in the familiar way, not whispering to dark gods and wearing the marks of the ruinous powers, but fundamentally reoriented, their loyalty replaced by something that served the Rangda's purposes. And the soldiers who followed them, shaped by their gene seed and the deep bonds that form in Space Marine legions, would have followed them into whatever the Rangda had turned them toward. Under this theory, the lost Primarchs were not villains, they were victims, and the tragedy of their fate was compounded by the necessity of the cover-up, and the further tragedy that suppressing the knowledge of what happened to them prevented the Imperium from developing defenses against the kind of attack that killed its sons. The Honorable Rebellion Theory. Several passages in the lore hint that the lost Primarchs' failure was different in kind from the traitor Primarchs' betrayal. The language used to describe them is consistently softer than the language used for Horus and his corrupted brothers. Gilliman uses language of failure and sadness, not treachery. The Emperor shows sorrow, not anger. Dorn calls their absence a tragedy, not a crime. Malcador says they are lost, not condemned. What if they found out something true about the Emperor's plan that they could not live with? The Emperor made bargains on a world called Molech to gain the knowledge needed to create the Primarchs, bargains with forces from within the warp itself. What if one or both of the lost Primarchs discovered this? What if they traced the origin of their own existence back to a deal their father had made with the very darkness they were fighting? What if they confronted him, refused to continue, chose to walk away, not toward chaos, but simply away from an enterprise they could not morally sustain? Guilliman himself, upon his resurrection in the 42nd millennium, is documented as struggling deeply with his feelings about the Emperor. He is angry. He finds the methods arrogant and cruel in certain ways. He questions the justifications even while remaining committed to the mission. What if, 10,000 years earlier, two brothers felt those same doubts more acutely and acted on them? Not out of corruption, out of conscience. Under this theory, the erasure was the silencing of a legitimate question. If it became known that two of the Emperor's sons had looked at his project and chosen to step away from it, not toward chaos, but toward simple refusal, it would give every future doubter permission to doubt. And you cannot run an empire on a broken founding myth. The catastrophic genetic failure theory. The Primarch project was science pushed to its absolute limit, with knowledge from dangerous sources, conducted under time pressure, 20 test cases, each one a miracle. What if one or two had catastrophic flaws built in? Not the manageable imperfections that affected all the others, the Red Thirst and the Canis Helix and the Black Rage, but something fundamental, something that would eventually, inevitably, have made those warriors incompatible with human civilization in ways that could not be corrected. Some theorists suggest that one of the missing Primarchs might have been a blank at the Primarch scale, a psychic null field so powerful that their presence suppressed all warp activity in their vicinity. A Primarch-level blank would be a walking, psychic dead zone. The Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that allows interstellar travel, might struggle to function in their presence. The Space Marine legions built on the psychic resonance between Primarch and warriors might find that resonance severed. Such a being would be, by their very nature, incompatible with the infrastructure of the Imperium's own power. Under this theory, the erasure was mercy dressed as punishment. The Primarchs had done nothing wrong. Their soldiers had done nothing wrong. But the design was flawed in ways that made them dangerous simply by existing, and the only way to protect the future was to remove the flaw entirely. The fratricidal war theory. This is smaller than the others, but persistent. The 2nd and 11th Legions went to war with each other for reasons that surviving lore does not record. Whatever caused it, they reached a breaking point and acted on it, and the result was Space Marines killing Space Marines during what was supposed to be a golden age. The erasure then served multiple purposes, covering up the fact that two legions had destroyed each other, protecting the morale of the surviving legions, and preventing the specific ideological conflict that drove the war from being studied and possibly emulated. The distinction between forgotten and purged would fit this theory neatly. One legion was more culpable and was actively destroyed, purged with intention. The other was drawn in by loyalty to its Primarch and treated with something closer to sorrow than judgment, forgotten rather than condemned. The experiment that cannot be named. There is a phrase in the Warhammer fandom wiki entry for the lost Primarchs that has been generating speculation for years, a reference to an aborted experiment connected to one of the lost legions, described only as the redacted experiment, with the actual designation replaced by a content warning placeholder. The entry notes, this has long been the subject of dark rumor. Whatever this experiment was, it involved one of the lost legions. It was connected to the Emperor's own genetic work, and it was apparently significant enough that even the reference to it required censorship rather than description. Some theorists connect this to the creation of the Adeptus Custodes themselves, suggesting one of the lost Primarchs served as a test subject for pushing the Primarch template in directions that produced something other than Space Marines. Others suggest it involved alien genetics. The word redacted is there in the official text, standing in for something real, and what it stands in for has a shape. Section 8. The Blood Ravens. Of all the Space Marine chapters in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, the Blood Ravens are the ones most visibly shaped by absence. They are a chapter that does not know where it came from, not in the vague way that many chapters have murky histories, but in the specific and deeply uncomfortable way that their own records of their founding have been destroyed. The records held by the Inquisition about their gene seed origin have been sealed, and the identity of their Primarch has been deliberately removed from every accessible database in the Imperium. The Blood Ravens know they have a Primarch. Every chapter does. The gene seed has to come from somewhere, but they cannot determine whose. Multiple attempts by their own scholars and librarians to trace their genetic heritage through biological analysis have failed in ways that researchers describe as strange, not simply inconclusive, as insufficient data would produce. Strange. As though the biology resists being resolved, as though somewhere in the genetics there is an intentional obscurity preventing the answer from emerging. This has led to two significant theories, both connecting to the missing Primarchs. The first is the Thousand Sons connection. The Blood Ravens have an extraordinary concentration of librarians and a chapter culture organized around the pursuit and preservation of knowledge to a degree unusual even by Space Marine standards. Their battle cries echo formulations used by the Thousand Sons. Ahriman, the greatest sorcerer produced by the Thousand Sons after Magnus himself, has encountered Blood Ravens in the lore and treated them with possessive recognition, calling them not so different in a way that means more than it says. If the Blood Ravens carry Thousand Sons gene seed, their unknown Primarch is Magnus the Red, a daemon, a traitor. This would explain the sealing of their records. A chapter demonstrably descended from a traitor Primarch would normally be destroyed, not tolerated, unless the Imperium needed the soldiers badly enough to overlook the question. The second theory connects the Blood Ravens directly to the missing legions. Perhaps they carry the gene seed of Primarch II or Primarch 11, survivors of the erasure who were mind-wiped and eventually formed the core of a new chapter under a new identity. Their obsession with knowledge might then be a trace memory of their original nature, something their original Primarch valued, that was baked into the gene seed at such a fundamental level that even millennia of institutional suppression could not scrub it out entirely. Both theories are supported by certain parts of the lore and contradicted by others. Games Workshop has had multiple opportunities to resolve the Blood Raven's origin definitively and has chosen not to take any of them. They are kept deliberately ambiguous, a living question within the larger question. What is confirmed is this: the Blood Ravens do not know who they are. They have built their entire culture around the pursuit of knowledge, which makes their particular ignorance about their own deepest identity both ironic and heartbreaking. They search for truth across the galaxy, and they have it already, written in their own cells, permanently inaccessible. Section 9. Why Games Workshop will probably never tell us. Rick Priestley is one of the co-creators of Warhammer 40,000, a designer who helped build the setting's foundations during his years at Games Workshop in the late 1980s and 1990s. He has been specific about why the Lost Legions exist. He said he created them to give the story some kind of deep background, unknowable 10,000-year-old mysteries, stuff that begs questions for which there could be no answer. He wanted the setting to contain things that resisted explanation, that stood at the edge of what the lore could tell you and refused to yield to it. The Lost Legions were his way of building that quality of bottomless depth into a setting that could otherwise have felt finite. He also noted with rueful humor that the decision to build an entire Horus Heresy narrative, hundreds of novels covering the 31st millennium in granular detail, somewhat undermined the unknowable mystery quality he originally intended. Once you commit to writing stories set in that era, good writers leave traces. They cannot help it. The fragments that have accumulated are significantly more detailed than Priestley intended when he first drew the blank spaces in the Legion roster. But the core principle remains. Games Workshop has maintained it through editorial decisions that must have been consciously difficult. When you have writers who clearly want to answer the question, and readers who clearly want the question answered, the decision to keep saying no requires sustained institutional commitment to the value of the mystery itself. From Games Workshop's perspective in the current era of the hobby, the Lost Primarchs serve a function that a definitive answer would destroy. The mystery generates sustained, renewable engagement. Every time a novel drops a new fragment, a sentence, a memory briefly restored, a name almost spoken before being caught, the forums light up. Threads appear analyzing every implication of every word. Lore channels spend hours exploring every angle. The speculation is itself a form of play, one that involves the audience actively rather than asking them to receive a story passively. A definitive answer would convert the mystery into a fact. Facts are interesting, but they do not generate the same ongoing engagement that an open question does. Once you know the answer, you know it. The question asks something of you continuously, over years, over decades. The answer takes that work from you and gives you something static in return. Priestley's inspiration came partly from real Roman history. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD saw 3 Roman legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, annihilated in a catastrophic ambush by Germanic tribes. The humiliation was so profound that Rome subsequently forbade the reuse of those legion numbers. No later Roman legion ever bore those designations. The wound was deep enough to leave a permanent scar in the numerical system of Rome's most powerful institution. He also knew about damnatio memoriae as a real historical practice. Real archaeologists have had to reconstruct the existence of people subjected to it through exactly the kind of circumstantial gap analysis we have been doing in this video, reading the empty plinths, the redacted names, the careful spaces where something used to be. The practice left traces even when most rigorously applied, because erasure itself is evidence of the thing that was erased. Priestley built that paradox into the DNA of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, and it has proven to be one of the most durable and generative creative decisions in the history of the hobby. Section 10. What this means for everything else. The lost Primarchs are not just an interesting mystery in isolation. They change what everything around them means. Consider the Space Wolves, celebrated in the lore as noble, savage warriors, fierce and loyal and deeply human in their bonds of brotherhood and their love of saga and song. Their culture is built around the idea of the warrior family, the pack that fights and feasts and grieves together. And yet they executed their brothers. They may have done it not once, but twice. Under orders, yes. But when you are a Primarch, and the Emperor sends you to destroy another Primarch and their entire legion, the order coming from above does not make the act something other than what it is. Russ carried that. You can see it in how he eventually walked into the warp rather than continue to be what the Imperium needed him to be. Consider Rogel Dorn, the most stoic of the Primarchs, the builder, the man who designed the defenses of the Imperial Palace and held them during the heresy, who paced the walls and calculated and endured. He saw the truth of the lost Primarchs and chose not to know it. From a man whose defining quality is his refusal to back away from anything, that choice to embrace ignorance over knowledge is devastating. Whatever he saw was too much even for him. Consider Sanguinius, the most beautiful, the most beloved, the winged angel. He loved his children so much he was afraid to tell his father about the Blood Angel's curse, and the specific thing he was afraid of was becoming a third empty plinth. That fear had a concrete referent, the 2 brothers who had already been erased. The Primarchs thought about those absences. They measured their own vulnerabilities against them. The empty pedestals were not abstract history. They were present in the daily calculation of what was allowed and what was too dangerous to admit. Consider the Emperor himself. He created 20 sons. He found all 20 of them. He lost 2, not to the war that eventually shattered his civilization, but before any of that, during the Golden Age. And then he sealed the evidence so thoroughly that even the surviving sons could not remember their brothers clearly and kept going. He kept planning. He sent Horus to be his war master and trusted in the loyalty of the remaining children and pressed on toward whatever distant goal he had in mind. What does it mean that he could absorb that loss? 2 sons, 2 entire legions, something Rogel Dorn said was worse than the Horus heresy, and simply continue. Is it strength? Pragmatism of the kind that only makes sense if you have been alive for tens of thousands of years? Or is it the behavior of a being who was always willing to spend his children if the mission required it? Who loved them, perhaps, but never loved them more than the plan? That is the question the lost Primarchs leave behind. Not just who they were, but what their erasure tells us about the person who ordered it. Section 11. The silence that speaks. We have walked through everything the lore gives us. The empty plinths, the redacted tables, the conversations that stop mid-sentence, the faces Rogel Dorn could not remember, the Rangdan Xenocides and their terrible timing, the Space Wolves and their role as executioners, the chamber at the end of memory, and the choice to unknow. The Blood Ravens and their perpetual search for an origin story the Imperium does not want them to have. We have walked through the theories: corruption during the Xenocides, honorable rebellion, genetic catastrophe, fratricidal war, the experiment that cannot be named. None of these is confirmed. Any of them could be true. The most likely reality is probably stranger than any individual theory and draws from several at once. These things tend to be. The truth behind great silences tends to be composed of multiple smaller truths that do not fit neatly into a single explanation. But the mystery of the lost Primarchs is not a flaw in the setting. It is not a loose end that will eventually be corrected. It is a feature. It does something that very few pieces of fiction successfully do, which is to invite you into the work of knowing, to give you enough material to think with while withholding the conclusion that thinking points toward. Most stories tell you things. This one asks you to figure something out while deliberately keeping the solution out of reach. It creates a collaboration between the creators and the audience, a shared space where the question is the content and sitting with uncertainty is the experience itself. And it trusts you to tolerate not knowing. It trusts that you find the mystery worthwhile, that the question is worth more to you than a clean resolution would be. That is not comfortable. It is not satisfying in the way answers are satisfying, but it is real in a way that comfortable, satisfying storytelling rarely manages to be. Because in the actual world, in actual history, in actual human civilization, there are things we do not know and will never know. There are records that were truly, completely destroyed. There are names that were chiseled off every stone they were ever cut into, burned in every archive that held them, stripped from every living memory through social pressure and institutional authority and simple time. And we know those people existed only because the absence of them has a shape. We know the erasure happened because the erasure left evidence of itself. The Primarchs of the 2nd and 11th Legions are, in that sense, among the truest things in Warhammer 40,000. They represent, with a kind of fictional honesty, what it means for something to actually be erased. Not perfectly gone. Nothing is ever perfectly gone, but shaped by the erasure into something new, something that is only the outline of itself. A truth that refuses to completely disappear, no matter how many resources are directed at making it do so. 2 empty plinths in a palace that spans a continent, standing in a row of 18 occupied ones, impossible to make invisible. 2 blank spaces in a table of 20 names, their redaction bars measuring the approximate length of what was taken. A gap in every novel and every tactical document and every Legion roster that has ever listed the forces of the Imperium. A fear in Sanguinius's voice when he named what he was afraid of. A sorrow in the Emperor's face when a son asked a question that had no comfortable answer. A choice Rogel Dorn made in a chamber at the end of memory, to let something go rather than carry it forward into the wars to come. These are the things that remain when everything else is taken, and they are, in their own quiet way, more than enough. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is full of terrible truths hiding behind institutional silences, full of things that happened and were covered over, things that are still happening beneath the surface of what the Imperium shows to its citizens. The lost Primarchs are not unique in this, but they are the most visible crack in the official story. The crack that has been there from almost the beginning of the setting, that has resisted 10,000 years of institutional pressure to seal it shut, that refuses to stop asking the question it was never supposed to ask. Who were they? And what did they do? Thank you for sitting with this one all the way to the end. There is something about this particular mystery that moves me more than almost anything else in the Warhammer setting. The sheer scale of the silence around it, the precision of the absence, the way every clue that survives feels like something that was fought for against enormous institutional resistance. These 2 Primarchs have no names in the record, no faces, no battles that we are allowed to call theirs. And yet here we are, spending all this time thinking about them together, which means the erasure did not entirely work. The fact that they existed is still alive in the question, even after 10,000 years. If this video resonated with you, if you found yourself genuinely moved by the weight of it, or frustrated by the mystery, or just glad to have company while sitting in the dark with an unanswerable question, please subscribe. Hit the like button if you made it this far. Share this with someone who loves this kind of thing, someone who understands that sometimes the best stories are the ones that refuse to end. Until next time, sleep well. Expanded section. The Emperor's Genetic Laboratory in Depth. To truly appreciate the weight of what was lost when Legions 2 and 11 ceased to exist, you need to spend more time in that laboratory. Not the sanitized version of events that the Imperium permits its citizens to know, but the stranger, darker version that the most restricted historical records hint at. The Himalayan complex was not simply a scientific facility. It was a place where the Emperor did things that, by any reasonable measure of the ethics that preceded him, should not have been possible and perhaps should not have been done. He created beings who were, in any meaningful sense, children. He created them with specific purposes already encoded into their genetics, with specific roles already allocated to them before they had drawn their first breath. He created them knowing that the Chaos Gods would try to use them, knowing that the scattering was a real possibility, knowing that the warp would touch every one of them during the years they spent landing on distant worlds and growing up without him. He created them anyway, because he needed them, because without them, the Great Crusade was slower, less certain, more vulnerable to the kind of attrition that a long enough war would eventually produce, even against a brilliant general's best efforts. The Primarchs were not just military assets, though they were certainly that. They were also proof of concept. They were evidence that humanity could produce beings capable of matching the most powerful threats in the galaxy, that the species was not simply prey waiting to be consumed by whatever horror emerged from the dark between the stars. So, when two of them were lost, the Emperor lost more than generals. He lost proof. He lost 2 data points in his evidence that the Primarch project was a success. He lost, in some way, that the surviving records circle around without naming, a part of his argument for why humanity deserved the galaxy. And then he buried the evidence that he had lost them at all. Consider what that required. The Primarch project involved thousands of people across multiple disciplines. Scientists and geneticists and bioengineers and psychic scholars who understood the warp components of the work. Administrators who processed the paperwork. Guards who protected the facility. Navigators who traveled with the expeditions that eventually found each Primarch on their distant worlds. Representatives of the Mechanicus who maintained the equipment. All of these people, at various points, knew that 20 Primarchs were created. Many of them knew, in the years before the erasure, that 18 Primarchs had been found, and 2 had not yet been found, but were out there somewhere, in pods that landed on worlds nobody had yet identified. When the decision was made to erase Legions 2 and 11, all of those people had to be dealt with. Their memories had to be altered, or their records had to be corrected, or they had to simply disappear. The scale of the operation required to achieve even an imperfect erasure must have been staggering. The resources spent, the institutional coordination required, the number of individual acts of bureaucratic violence, small and large, that had to be executed with precision by people who themselves would then need to be dealt with. This is why the memory modification program that Malkador reveals in the chamber at the end of memory is so significant. You do not modify the memories of Primarchs, beings with some of the most powerful minds in human history, for anything less than absolute necessity. The logistics alone would be nightmarish. The risk of something going wrong, of a modified memory producing inconsistencies that the Primarch's intellect would then investigate and potentially unravel, would be enormous. The fact that Malkador undertook this, and that it largely worked, suggests either an extraordinary level of psychic capability on Malkador's part, which the lore supports, or some additional mechanism that we are not told about, some drug or procedure or technology that made minds accessible in ways that even a Primarch's defensive capabilities could not prevent. And then there is the question of the Space Marines themselves, the tens of thousands of warriors who had served in Legions 2 and 11, who had followed their Primarchs across dozens of worlds, who had fought in battles that were then erased from the records, so that those warriors had no history, no context, no narrative to place themselves within. If they were mind-wiped and redistributed rather than executed, they went into their new legions as people who had been stripped of their stories. They knew how to fight. They had the skills and the instincts and the reflexes that came from years of combat experience. But the memory of how they had developed those skills was gone. They were veterans without wars to have won them in. warriors without battles to have hardened them. What does that do to a person? Even a superhuman person, even a being whose psychology has been engineered for resilience and whose emotional processing is different from a regular human's. To have your history taken from you is a specific kind of violence. Quieter than most forms of violence, but in some ways more complete. You are still yourself. You still have your personality and your preferences and your particular way of moving through the world. But the story of how you became yourself is gone, and with it, the ability to understand why you are the way you are. The Blood Ravens, if they carry the gene seed of one of the lost legions, are living with the downstream consequences of this violence. Their chapter's obsessive pursuit of knowledge might be partly explained not just as a cultural inheritance from their original Primarch, but as an institutional trauma response. They search for knowledge because their founding trauma was the removal of knowledge. They collect and preserve records because their original records were taken. They are, on some level, trying to undo a thing that was done to them before they were born. This is, in the most literal sense, a wound that has persisted for 10,000 years. Expanded section: The Roman Legions and What History Teaches Us. Rick Priestley was studying archaeology when he first became interested in wargaming. This is not a coincidence in relation to the lost Primarchs. Archaeologists spend much of their professional lives reading absence. They look at what is missing and ask why. They find the gap in the record and understand that the gap tells you something. They know that what a civilization chooses to destroy says as much about that civilization as what it chooses to preserve. The Roman inspiration for the lost legions is documented through Priestley's own comments, but it is worth dwelling on the specific details of that historical parallel because they illuminate the Warhammer version in useful ways. In 9 AD, in the forests of what is now northern Germany, 3 Roman legions were destroyed in an ambush organized by a Germanic chieftain named Arminius. Arminius had served in the Roman military and understood Roman tactics, and he used that understanding to lure 3 legions, somewhere between 15 and 20,000 soldiers, into a narrow forest corridor during a rainstorm where their standard formations were useless. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions of Rome were annihilated. Their commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, killed himself rather than be captured. Very few survivors made it back. The disaster at Teutoburg Forest was one of the greatest military defeats in Roman history, and the Roman response to it was instructive. Rome did not simply mourn and rebuild. It performed a specific act of institutional grief that bordered on the irrational. It retired the numbers of the 3 destroyed legions forever. No subsequent Roman legion ever bore the number 17, 18, or 19. The numbers became haunted. They became the shape of a wound that Rome could not speak about directly, but could not pretend did not exist. Later, Roman emperors did raise new legions, did rebuild military capacity, did eventually secure the Rhine frontier through other means, but those numbers stayed empty. They became part of the military's numerical system as absences, holes that every officer and administrator and historian would eventually notice and have to be told not to ask about, or told a version of the story that did not include the full weight of what happened. This is the structure Priestley replicated in the Warhammer setting, but at a scale that takes the Roman concept and amplifies it to mythological proportions. 2 legion numbers that cannot be used, 2 Primarchs who cannot be named, a wound in the institutional memory of the Imperium that 10,000 years and the full machinery of a galactic civilization have not been able to close. The difference, of course, is that the Roman disaster was a military defeat by an external enemy, humiliating but ultimately straightforward. The loss of Legions 2 and 11 was something else entirely, something internal, something that the Imperium could not frame as simply losing a battle. Whatever happened was bad enough that the Imperium's response was not to mourn publicly and rebuild, but to pretend the loss had never occurred. And that distinction between mourning a defeat and erasing a history is the most significant thing about the mystery. When you mourn a defeat, you acknowledge it. You build monuments to the fallen. You name the enemy who hurt you, and you process the injury as a society. You find some way to integrate the loss into your ongoing story of who you are. Rome mourned Teutoburg Forest. Roman soldiers visited the site of the battle centuries later and paid respects to the dead. The wound was acknowledged even if the numbers were retired. When you erase a history, you are saying something different. You are saying that acknowledging this loss would be more dangerous than the loss itself. That the story of what happened cannot be integrated into the ongoing narrative, because the story of what happened would break the narrative entirely. This is a very specific kind of institutional decision, one made from a very specific kind of fear. The Imperium feared what would happen if people knew what happened to Legions 2 and 11. Not the fact that they were gone, but the reason. Whatever the reason was, it was too dangerous to become known history. Expanded section. Sanguinius and the Third Empty Plinth. We have touched on the Fear to Tread passage involving Sanguinius and his terror of the Third Empty Plinth, but this deserves much more careful attention, because it is one of the most quietly devastating things in the entire Horus Heresy body of literature. Sanguinius is, by most accounts, the most beloved of all the Primarchs. He is physically beautiful to a degree that the novels describe as almost supernatural, with great feathered wings and a face of angelic calm that tends to produce profound emotional responses in anyone who stands near him. He is compassionate in ways that distinguish him from most of his brothers, genuinely moved by the suffering of the people he protects, genuinely invested in their well-being rather than just in their usefulness to the campaign. He is also, privately, living with a terror that the novels are careful to present as reasonable rather than pathological, the fear that his children are going to be destroyed. The Blood Angels carry the red thirst. This is a psychic hunger, a dark reflection of Sanguinius's own nature as an apex psychic being that emerges in his warriors in moments of stress or battle. In its milder forms, it produces aggression and a predatory intensity that can be strategically useful. In its severe forms, it produces something that looks very much like the kind of warp-touched madness that the Emperor had, in other contexts, used as justification for very serious action against very serious legions. Sanguinius is hiding this from the Emperor. He has been hiding it for years by the time of Fear to Tread, managing the red thirst within his legion through a combination of strict protocols and the sheer force of his own psychic presence as an anchor for his warriors. He is succeeding at hiding it in the sense that it has not yet become a crisis, but he is not succeeding at making it go away. It is there, in every Blood Angel's warrior, a hereditary curse built into the gene seed at a level that cannot be surgically corrected without destroying the gene seed entirely. When Horus confronts him about why he has not told the Emperor, Sanguinius's response is raw and immediate. He says he will not be responsible for a third empty plinth, and in the context of a conversation between two of the most powerful beings alive, in a setting where both of them know exactly what happened to Legions 2 and 11, that statement has a precise and terrible weight. He is not speaking hyperbolically. He is not exaggerating for emotional emphasis. He is making a factual claim about what he believes would happen if the Emperor found out. The Blood Angels would be erased from history, the same way the 2nd and 11th were erased. He would become the forgotten or the purged. He would join two brothers whose very names have been stripped from the record. And his soldiers, tens of thousands of warriors who have given everything in service to the Emperor's dream, would become ghosts who were quietly absorbed into other legions or simply never spoken of again. What does it mean that Sanguinius considers this a realistic outcome? Not a worst-case paranoid fantasy. A realistic assessment of what the Emperor would do if he discovered that a gene seed flaw was producing potentially dangerous behavior in a legion of Space Marines. It means the precedent set by Legions 2 and 11 was understood by the other Primarchs as a template, as a policy that the Emperor was willing to apply, as evidence that the Emperor valued the functionality of his project more than the existence of individual sons, that if you showed him a flaw he could not tolerate, the response would not be patient assistance or search for a solution. The response would be removal. This is a devastating thing to know about a father. Even if you understand why he might operate that way, even if you accept the strategic logic of removing an irreparably flawed element from a galaxy-wide military project, the knowledge that this is how your father thinks about you is something that cannot be unfelt. Sanguinius carried it. He hid the red thirst not out of shame, but out of survival for his children, and the fact that he framed it explicitly in terms of the third empty plinth tells you how present those two absent brothers were in his daily life. The lost Primarchs were not just history to the surviving ones. They were warnings. They were a constant reminder of the conditions under which the Emperor's love and support had limits. Expanded section: Leman Russ, the Executioner, and what that title costs. There is a temptation when reading about Leman Russ to take him at his own terms. He is presented in the lore as someone who has made peace with his role, who is comfortable with the ferocity that the Emperor calls upon when it is needed, who does not spend a lot of time in the kind of introspective torment that other Primarchs seem to specialize in. He is the Wolf King. He is decisive and direct. He goes where he is sent and does what is required, and then he goes home. But the lore is more complicated than this surface reading, if you follow it carefully enough. Leman Russ is the Emperor's executioner. He is called this by the Custodes, and he accepts the title, and his legion wears it with the kind of warrior pride that comes from doing hard things and doing them well. But over the course of the Horus Heresy series, particularly in the novels set during the actual heresy rather than the Great Crusade, you see Russ wrestling with what being the executioner has required of him. Not in the melodramatic way some Primarchs process their guilt and doubt, in a quieter, more persistent way, a way that suggests the wrestling has been going on for a long time and has not produced a resolution. He destroyed Prospero. This is perhaps his most famous act of execution, the burning of Magnus the Red's homeworld on the Emperor's orders. The Horus Heresy series complicates this considerably, revealing that Russ may have been manipulated into going to Prospero with an order to destroy rather than capture, and that the mission as he understood it was different from the mission as it was actually ordered. But he went, and he burned the world. And Magnus, whatever errors he had made and whatever part his psychic transgression played in the catastrophe that followed, was not a chaos-corrupted being at the time. He was a Primarch who had made a terrible mistake while trying to serve the Emperor, and Russ was sent to punish him for it. After Prospero, Russ is described in the novels as questioning his role, not abandoning it, not collapsing into guilt, but questioning, asking whether the Emperor's executioner is a title that serves the Emperor's vision of humanity or a title that, in its application, undermines it. Whether there is a meaningful difference between destroying a legion that has turned to chaos and destroying a legion that has simply failed in a way the Emperor cannot accommodate. The Lost Legions are the place where that question has its sharpest edge, because the Lost Legions, if the most sympathetic readings of the lore are correct, were not traitors. They were failed experiments, or victims, or beings who made choices that the Emperor could not tolerate but that were not, in any simple sense, evil. And Russ, who was apparently among those who executed judgment on them, has to live with that distinction. He eventually disappears into the warp. He announces one day during the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension that he is dying, and he walks out with his Varagir bodyguard and is not seen again. The Space Wolves believe he will return at the time of the final apocalypse, the Wolf Time. But the timing of his disappearance is telling. He goes during the heresy, after he has been used as the Emperor's weapon one too many times. After Prospero, and after the questions that followed Prospero, have compounded with whatever older questions already lived in him from the earlier executions he performed during the Great Crusade. He is one of the most tragic figures in the whole setting, and the tragedy is all in what is not said, in the title he bears, in the offhand comment about the two lost legions that he makes without elaborating, in the disappearance that follows a feast where he announces he is dying, when the physical evidence suggests he is not dying at all, and what he might actually be dying is something more interior. Expanded section: the shape of what remains. There is a concept in archaeology and in certain kinds of literary theory called negative space evidence, evidence that is constituted entirely by what is not there. A hole in a record has a shape. An empty plinth has dimensions. A name that has been struck out of a document leaves a gap that tells you approximately how many characters long that name was. Absence, in other words, is not the same as nothing. Absence is information. The lost Primarchs are, at this point, constituted almost entirely from negative space evidence. We know their numbers. We know the approximate size of their legions from the gaps they left behind in the numerical accounting. We know the approximate timing of their erasure from the references in other novels that treat their disappearance as a known fact. We know the rough shape of what was done to them. not the content, but the form of the institutional response, because the response was consistent enough that its outlines are visible even through the censorship. We know that the response to whatever happened was not standard punitive action of the kind the Imperium applied to other failures and misbehaviors during the Great Crusade. Standard punitive action involves public acknowledgement, formal judicial process, and either correction or destruction that is documented for future reference, so the same mistake can be avoided. The response to Legions 2 and 11 was different in kind. It was the kind of response that treats the entire event as a problem to be made invisible, rather than a lesson to be learned. This tells us something about the nature of the event. If it were simply a betrayal, even a horrific one, the Imperium would have documented it and used it as a cautionary tale, the way it uses the story of the Horus Heresy itself. The Horus Heresy is terrible, but it is known. Children in the Imperium grow up hearing stories about the War Master who turned on the Emperor. The story serves a function. It explains why loyalty is paramount, why chaos is to be feared, why the Primarchs who followed Horus were wrong. The story is deployed as a warning and as a justification for the Imperium's most draconian security measures. The Lost Legions are not deployed as a cautionary tale. They are not used as evidence for anything, except in the most indirect possible way, in the whisper of empty pedestals and the silence that greets questions about the numerical gaps in the Legion roster. This suggests that the story of what happened to them cannot serve the purpose that cautionary tales serve, either because the story is too complicated to reduce to a clean moral, or because the story implicates someone or something that the Imperium cannot afford to implicate, or because the story, if known, would not produce the response of righteous horror and strengthened loyalty that the story of Horus produces. It would produce something else, something the Imperium cannot risk. And so, the silence persists. 10,000 years of it, maintained through effort and coordination, and the deliberate modification of memories that should have made the maintenance of the silence impossible. 10,000 years of empty plinths and redacted names and carefully stopped sentences in novels set during the Golden Age. 10,000 years of a wound that will not close, because closing it would require acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would require saying what it was. The Primarchs of the 2nd and 11th Legions are defined by this silence. They are made of it. Whatever they actually were, whatever they actually did, whatever the truth of their existence actually contains, that content has been replaced by its own absence. They are the space where something was, the outline of a presence so thoroughly removed that even the people who removed it cannot remember what they removed. And in that outline, in that precise and deliberate shape of nothing, the mystery lives, not as a puzzle waiting to be solved, though it can be approached that way, and the approach has its pleasures, but as a truth about how civilizations work, about what institutions do when they encounter things they cannot integrate, about the distance between what a civilization says it is and what it actually does when the cost of its ideals becomes too high. The Imperium of Man presents itself as the guardian of humanity, as the force standing between the species and annihilation, as the inheritor of everything good that the Emperor intended when he began the Great Crusade with 20 sons in gestation pods and a plan for the stars. And most of the time, from most angles, this self-presentation holds together well enough to be functional. The Lost Primarchs are the angle from which it does not hold together. They are the question the Imperium cannot answer without undermining itself. They are the thing that happened in the Golden Age, before the fall, when everything was still supposed to be going according to plan. And they are still there, still present in their absence, still asking their question from the shape of 2 empty pedestals in a palace that spans a continent. Who were they? What did they do? And what does it mean that we cannot know? Expanded section. Closing thoughts on mystery as a creative device. The Lost Primarchs work as a creative device because they do something that successful mysteries always do. They make the audience feel the absence. Not just know about it intellectually, but feel it. The empty pedestals are not a plot hole. They are a deliberate construction designed to produce a specific emotional response in anyone who notices them, the response of encountering a gap where something should be, and feeling the pull of that gap as a gravitational force. The best mysteries in fiction have this quality. They do not just withhold information. They construct the withholding so that the shape of what is withheld becomes its own kind of presence. The reader or viewer or listener does not simply know that something is missing. They feel the shape of the missing thing. They can trace its outline even without knowing its content. And in tracing that outline, they form a relationship with it that no direct revelation could produce, because the direct revelation would immediately begin the process of forgetting, the settling of information into the category of known things rather than felt things. The lost Primarchs have remained in the category of felt things for decades, for millions of people, across dozens of countries and cultures and languages. That is an extraordinary achievement for what is, at its core, a deliberate absence in a tabletop wargame's backstory. It speaks to something genuine about how human minds work, about how we are drawn to gaps and voids in ways that completeness does not produce, about how the unknown exercises a hold on imagination that the known, once settled, cannot maintain. Games Workshop understood this, even if the understanding was partly intuitive rather than explicitly theorized. Priestley knew he was doing something when he left those numbers blank. He had studied archaeology. He had encountered negative space evidence professionally in the context of actual historical analysis. He knew that what a civilization chose not to record was often more interesting than what it chose to record, because the choice not to record something was itself a document of that civilization's values and fears. So he built that principle into a science fiction setting about humanity 10,000 years in the future, in a universe where the same principles of historical self-deception and institutional violence and the suppression of inconvenient truths that have always governed human civilization have simply been scaled up to a galactic scope. The Imperium is Rome in many ways, but Rome with faster-than-light travel and psychic powers and gods who are actually real and hungry and close. And like Rome, it does things it cannot acknowledge. And like Rome, the things it cannot acknowledge leave traces. The lost Primarchs are the most visible of those traces. The crack in the official story that everyone can see and nobody is officially supposed to notice. The question that 10,000 years of institutional effort could not silence. And that, in the end, is why they matter. Not just as a fun mystery or an interesting puzzle or a lore deep dive that keeps YouTube channels running for years, but as a statement about the setting they inhabit, about the civilization they represent, about the fundamental truth that the things a society most wants to hide are often the most important things to know about it. The Imperium of Man is built on many things, on faith and force and the endless grinding labor of billions of human beings, on the memory of a golden age and the long ruin of everything that followed, on the sacrifice of individuals who gave everything in service of something they believed was worth everything, and on two empty pedestals in a palace on a dying world, where two suns once stood and now are gone, and where the silence around their absence is louder than anything written on the 18 occupied plinths beside them. Remember that the next time someone tells you the Imperium is the good guys. Expanded section. What the Horus heresy tells us about how the Emperor processes loss. To understand the lost Primarchs fully, it helps to understand how the Emperor handles the other tragedies that befall his family, because the contrast is revealing. When Horus turns traitor, the Emperor does not initially erase him. He does not pull down statues or strike the name from records. He prepares for war. He builds defenses. He grieves, in whatever private way a 10,000-year-old psychic deity grieves. And then, at the end of the Siege of Terra, when Horus is aboard his flagship and the Emperor has teleported up to face him, the Emperor does not go there to erase his son. He goes there to save him, if saving is still possible. And when it is not, when Horus has gone too far and the only mercy remaining is the mercy of ending, the Emperor kills him himself, directly, personally, with the full cost of that act absorbed into his own body as the killing blow that puts him on the golden throne. The Emperor chose, with Horus, to fight rather than to erase. He chose to mourn openly rather than to pretend the loss had not occurred. The Horus heresy is known history. It is terrible history, but it is known, and the knowing of it serves a purpose. Now compare that response to the response to Legions 2 and 11. No war, no mourning that anyone can remember. No public accounting of what went wrong and why. Just the careful, thorough, systematic removal of every trace, accompanied by the modification of memories in beings who should have been impossible to modify. The contrast is significant enough to constitute evidence. The Emperor treated the loss of Horus as a tragedy to be faced. He treated the loss of Legions 2 and 11 as a problem to be solved by making it invisible. And the only reason to make something invisible rather than facing it is that facing it would cost more than invisibility costs. Horus's betrayal cost the Emperor his physical functioning body and 10,000 years of slow death on the Golden Throne. That is an almost incomprehensibly high cost. And yet, the Emperor chose to pay it, chose to face the conflict rather than deny it. Whatever the cost of facing the truth about Legions 2 and 11, the Emperor judged it higher still. Think about what that means. Think about what kind of truth would be more expensive to acknowledge than the truth of the Horus heresy. The Horus heresy killed the Emperor, and it was still cheaper to acknowledge than the thing that happened during the Golden Age of the Great Crusade. This is the mystery at its most precise. This is the specific shape of the thing that is missing, not just two Primarchs who went wrong, but a wrong so fundamental, so expensive, so threatening to the entire structure of the Imperium's self-understanding, that even a being who was willing to die rather than lie about the heresy chose, instead, to lie about this. The Emperor built the Imperium on many things. He built it on force and on psychic power, and on the organizational genius of Guillemot and the tactical brilliance of his sons. But he also built it on a story, on the narrative that humanity was worth saving, and that he was the one who could save it, and that his methods, however brutal, were justified by what they were trying to achieve. The Lost Primarchs are a threat to that story. Whatever they represent, it calls into question something the story depends on. And rather than revise the story to accommodate the truth, the Emperor chose to revise the truth to accommodate the story. That is what the empty pedestals mean. That is what they have always meant. A story that needed to be protected at a cost the Emperor was willing to pay, and that he spent 10 millennia making sure nobody could fully calculate. Expanded section. The Legiones Astartes, before the Primarchs returned. Something that gets lost in discussions of the Lost Primarchs is that the Space Marine legions existed for years, and in some cases decades, before their Primarchs were found. They fought in the early Great Crusade under the Emperor's direct command, and later under the command of human generals appointed by the Emperor. Without the demigod leaders, their genetics had been engineered to follow. This is a period that the Horus Heresy novels touch on occasionally, but never dwell on at length, partly because the story the novels want to tell is the story of the Primarchs, and the Primarchless era is prologue to that story. But it matters for our purposes, because it establishes something important. The legions had identities, cultures, and histories before their Primarchs arrived. And when a Primarch arrived, there was sometimes tension between the culture the legion had developed and the personality their gene father brought with him. The Dark Angels are the most documented example of this. The First Legion had been fighting for decades under human commanders by the time Lionel Johnson arrived on Caliban. The Legion had its own traditions, its own way of doing things, its own internal hierarchies. Johnson's arrival changed all of that, and not without friction. There are still secrets within the Dark Angels that trace back to that period, to things that happened before Johnson arrived, or in the difficult early years of integration between the Legion's old guard and their new Primarch's influence. Now consider the 2nd and 11th Legions through this lens. Both Primarchs were eventually found and united with their legions. Both legions, by the time that happened, had been functioning military organizations for years or decades. Both had cultures that predated their Primarchs. And then, whatever happened during or after the Rangdan genocides, both ceased to exist. The warriors of those legions, the ones who survived whatever happened, carried within them not just the Primarch's genetics, but the institutional memory of a legion. The rituals, the traditions, the particular ways of fighting and thinking and relating to each other that a legion develops over years of shared combat experience. If those warriors were mind-wiped and absorbed into the Ultramarines or the Imperial Fists, they brought all of that institutional memory with them in the form that persists even when conscious recollection is removed. Habit, instinct, the particular way a body moves when it has been trained a certain way for long enough. The Ultramarines who absorbed these warriors were changed by them in ways they would never be able to identify or trace. The Space Marine culture of the early Heresy era was shaped partly by legions that no longer existed, through the ghost influence of warriors who had been made to forget where they came from. This is one of the stranger implications of the theory that the lost legions were absorbed into surviving ones. The Imperium's most important military traditions, the ones that were eventually codified in the Codex Astartes and became the template for every Space Marine chapter that would exist for the next 10,000 years, were partly authored by warriors from legions the Codex does not acknowledge. The most authoritative military document in the history of the Imperium contains, somewhere in its foundational assumptions, the muscle memory of soldiers who are not supposed to exist. Expanded section. What future novels might reveal? It would be dishonest to pretend that Games Workshop's relationship with the mystery of the lost Primarchs is entirely stable. The setting is not static. New novels come out. New games launch. New creative decisions are made by new people who have different relationships with the lore and different ideas about what the mystery is worth. There are signs that the lost Primarchs are being slowly, carefully brought into sharper focus, even without being explicitly revealed. The accidental inclusion of their names in the uplifting primer, whether intentional or genuinely accidental, added a piece of information that was not previously canonical. The chamber at the end of memory added significant detail about the memory modification program. Recent novels set during the Siege of Terra have continued to drop fragments without resolving anything. The pattern suggests a deliberate, slow reveal, parceling out information in ways that deepen the mystery rather than resolve it, keeping it alive and active in the community's imagination while never quite tipping over into the kind of definitive statement that would close the door. Each new fragment confirms that there is a door. Each new fragment refuses to open it. This is, as a storytelling strategy, extremely sophisticated. It requires discipline and coordination across multiple authors and editors, because any individual author who decides they want to be the one who finally answers the question could, in a single novel, undermine decades of careful management. The fact that it has held for as long as it has is a testament to how well Games Workshop understands the value of what it has. But it is also a strategy with a shelf life. Mysteries that are maintained indefinitely, without any forward movement, eventually stop feeling like mysteries and start feeling like stalling. The community will notice if the fragments stop coming, if the clues stop deepening, if the mystery is maintained through the absence of new information rather than the strategic deployment of it. The Chamber at the End of Memory, published in an anthology that came out in 2018, represents perhaps the most significant forward movement the mystery has seen. It confirmed the memory modification. It confirmed that what happened was worse than the Horus Heresy from Dorn's perspective. It confirmed that the soldiers were spared, even as the Primarchs were not. These are not small additions. They significantly narrow the field of possible explanations and point in certain directions more strongly than others. What would the next forward movement look like? Perhaps a Primarch novel, in which one of the surviving Primarchs has a moment of memory restoration that goes slightly further than Dorn's, or that recovers a different fragment of what was lost. Perhaps a new Horus Heresy-era story set during the Rangdan Xenocides themselves, which would inevitably require engaging more directly with what happened to Legions 2 and 11, even if it maintained their specific fates as ambiguous. Perhaps a 41st Millennium story involving the Blood Ravens that pushes their origin question into a territory it has not been in before. Or perhaps none of these. Perhaps the mystery is maintained in its current state of productive ambiguity for another decade, or 2, or 20, becoming one of those things that the setting carries with it indefinitely as an expression of its own depth and complexity. There are worse fates for a mystery than to remain a mystery, as long as the mystery continues to feel alive. The Lost Primarchs feel alive. They have felt alive for 30-plus years. Whatever Games Workshop decides to do with them, the fact that they have sustained this level of engagement for this long suggests that Priestley's original instinct was correct. There are some questions that are worth more as questions than they could ever be worth as answers. Expanded section. A meditation on names. Everything in the Warhammer 40,000 setting has a name. The Primarchs have names that are, in most cases, deeply significant, names that carry within them something of their bearer's nature, or the world they grew up on, or the specific role they were created to fill. Sanguinius, the Blood One, the Angel. Angron, the Angry One, the blood-soaked berserker. Lorgar, the scripture writer, the one who needed to believe in something. Perturabo, the one who weathers, the endurer. Magnus the Red, the Great One, the Crimson Scholar. Even Horus Lupercal, taking his epithet from the cave where Rome's legendary founders were nursed by a wolf, heir to an entire tradition of imperial mythology in a single surname. Names matter in this setting. They are not arbitrary labels, they are declarations. And the two Primarchs who have been erased from history are defined, more than by anything else, by the absence of their names. We do not know what they were called. We do not even know if the Primarchs who knew them could remember the names before the memory modification was applied. Whatever significance was encoded in those names, whatever the names declared about who these two beings were, has been taken. There is something specifically cruel about this, about removing someone's name from the record. In many human cultures, the name is not just a label, but a soul, the thing that persists beyond death, that allows the living to maintain a connection with the departed, that gives the dead a presence in the world of the living. To remove a name is to do something more complete than killing the body. It is to kill the possibility of being remembered, which in some traditions is understood as a second, more final death. The Imperium performed this second death on two of the Emperor's sons. It killed them, or allowed them to be killed, and then it erased their names so thoroughly that not even the people who had spoken those names could remember having done so. What remains? The numbers, the empty plinths, the shape of the redaction bars in a classified table, the precise size of the gaps in Rogaldorn's memory of brothers he cannot quite remember, the fear in Sanguinius's voice, the sorrow on the Emperor's face, and the question that persists across 10,000 years of silence. Who were they? We may never know. But we feel the shape of what we do not know. And in that shape, in the outline of two lives too dangerous to acknowledge, something of them remains. The erasure did not fully work. It never does. That is the story of the Primarchs nobody knows exist. Two sons, two legions. Two empty spaces where history refuses to grow over the wound, because the wound was made too carefully, cut too precisely, for anything to grow there. Thank you for being here for all of it. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person I make these videos for. Leave a comment below with your favorite theory, or with whatever fragment of this mystery stuck with you most. I read them all. Subscribe if you have not, like if you found this worthwhile, and share it with someone who would appreciate sitting in the dark with a question that 10,000 years could not silence. Until next time, sleep well. Expanded section. The Ultramarines' suspicious growth and what it implies. Robert Guillemot is, by most measures, the most successful of all the Primarchs in the purely administrative and organizational sense. He built Ultramar, the 500 worlds of his domain, into something that functioned as a miniature imperium within the Imperium, with supply chains and governance structures and quality of life for ordinary citizens that most other domains could not match. He codified the Codex Astartes, the military doctrine that every subsequent Space Marine chapter would be measured against. He was, in every operational sense, the most effective son the Emperor produced. And by the time of the Horus Heresy, his legion was the largest. Not just larger than the others, but significantly larger, with numbers that dwarfed even the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves, who had been operational for much longer, and had fought through the Rangdan Genocides that devastated so many other forces. How did the Ultramarines become so large? Part of it is Guillemot's administrative genius. Part of it is the 500 worlds of Ultramar, providing an enormous recruiting base and the logistical infrastructure to process recruits efficiently. These are real factors, and they explain a real advantage. But the timing of the growth is suspicious in a way that the administrative explanations do not fully account for. The Ultramarines' most dramatic numerical expansion corresponds roughly to the period of the Rangdan Genocides and immediately after, in the same period when other legions were being devastated and reduced, when the 2nd and 11th legions were ceasing to exist, the 13th was growing. Dorn and Guillemot together persuaded Malcador to spare the soldiers of the lost legions. The chamber at the end of memory confirms this much, even while leaving ambiguous what was done with those soldiers afterward. But the most logical outcome, if 10,000 or more mind-wiped Space Marine veterans needed to be quietly absorbed somewhere without drawing attention, is that they went to legions large enough that several thousand new warriors would not be anomalous. The Ultramarines and the Imperial Fists are the natural candidates, not just because of their size, but because Guilliman and Dorn were the ones who made the request. If this theory is correct, it means that the Codex Astartes, the foundational document of Space Marine doctrine, was written by a Primarch who commanded a legion that included veterans from 2 erased legions who did not know where they had come from. It means the standards of Space Marine organization and conduct that every chapter tries to meet were shaped in ways that can never be traced by warriors who had been made to forget being warriors of a different kind. The ghosts of Legions 2 and 11 might be present in every Space Marine chapter that follows the Codex. In the specific way a company is organized, in the particular protocols for certain kinds of engagement, in the instincts that seem almost genetic, but are actually procedural, absorbed from veterans who carried the practices of 2 erased institutions in their muscle memory, even when their explicit recall of those institutions had been removed. The most orthodox tradition in Space Marine culture might be secretly the most heterodox. The cleanest line of descent might carry, hidden within it, the genetic and procedural legacy of the 2 lines that were supposed to have been permanently closed. Expanded section. Why the answer might be worse than any of the theories. We have spent considerable time with the major theories about what happened to Legions 2 and 11. Each theory has its merits and its weaknesses. Each one fits some of the evidence and is challenged by other parts of it, and each one is, ultimately, something that a human mind can hold comfortably. A story that makes sense in human terms, even if the moral stakes are very high and the tragedy very deep. But Rogel Dorn chose to forget. He chose to unknow what he had seen after seeing it, with full consideration of what the choice meant for a man who built his entire identity around facing things rather than flinching from them. Whatever the truth is, it is bad enough that a Primarch chose ignorance over it. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it is worth sitting with. Not one of the theories we have examined produces that result from a reasonable Rogel Dorn. The Rangdan corruption theory is terrible, but Dorn would not choose to unknow it. He would choose to carry it, to use it, to ensure the Imperium developed defenses against the kind of attack that took his brothers. That is what Dorn does with terrible truths. He turns them into fortifications. He would be broken by the knowledge, but he would not choose to be rid of it. The Honorable Rebellion theory is also terrible, but Dorn would not choose to unknow it either. He would grieve. He would understand. He might even secretly agree with the brothers who chose refusal over continuation, but he would not give up the knowledge. He would carry it as a private weight, the way he carries everything, stoically, alone, with perfect posture. Even the genetic failure theory and the fratricidal war theory, which are in some ways the most straightforwardly sad of the options, do not produce the specific reaction of choosing to unknow. Dorn has dealt with genetic failure in other contexts. He has dealt with Space Marine fratricide. These things are terrible, but they are the kinds of terrible that Dorn faces and documents and uses. Whatever he saw was different in kind from all of these. The closest parallel the setting offers is the Emperor's own secrets, the bargain on Molech, the knowledge that the Primarch project was built partly on deals with the Chaos Gods. The full extent of what the Emperor intended for humanity, beyond the scope of the Great Crusade, these are the kinds of truths that, when they emerge in the novels, produce reactions of genuine devastation, even in Primarchs who thought they were prepared for anything. Maybe what Dorn saw was something like that. Not a story about his 2 brothers specifically, but a truth about the Emperor's project as a whole, illustrated through the specific mechanism of his brothers' fates. A truth about what the Primarchs actually were at the most fundamental level. A truth about what the Great Crusade was actually for, beneath the rhetoric about human unity and the stars. A truth that Dorn, upon seeing, understood would be more destructive than helpful if he carried it into the wars ahead. The Horus heresy was caused partly by Primarchs, who found out too much and responded in ways that broke the Imperium. Maybe Dorn's choice to forget was not cowardice, but strategy. Maybe he looked at the truth, understood what it would do to him if he kept it, understood how it would change how he fought and led and existed in the Imperium. and made a calculated decision that a Dorn who did not know this truth was more valuable to humanity than a Dorn who did. If that is what happened, it is not a simple tragedy. It is a complicated one, the kind where the most heroic available choice is still a choice with a terrible cost. And that is where we leave it. Not with an answer, but with the shape of an answer. Not with a resolution, but with the outline of what a resolution would require us to accept. The Primarchs of the 2nd and 11th Legions will, if Games Workshop's historical pattern holds, remain unknown. They will remain defined by their absence, by the empty pedestals, and the redacted names, and the stopped sentences, and the fear in a beautiful angel's voice, and the sorrow on the face of a man who has been alive long enough that almost nothing makes him show what he feels. But the absence has a shape, and the shape tells a story, even without words. That story is about what civilizations choose to remember and what they choose to forget. It is about the difference between mourning and erasure. It is about what it means when the most powerful institution in human history decides that a truth is too expensive to acknowledge. It is about the specific and terrible cost of operating at the scale of a galaxy where individual lives and individual tragedies can be subsumed into strategic calculations without the people doing the calculating ever being required to face what the subtraction actually meant. It is, in the end, a story about silence, about the things we do not say, and why we do not say them, and what those silences reveal about who we are when we think nobody is looking. The empty pedestals are still there. They will be there tomorrow. They have been there for 10,000 years, and they will, barring something extraordinary, be there for 10,000 more. And every person who walks past them and notices and feels the pull of the absence and asks the question that the Imperium has spent 10 millennia trying to make unaskable is doing something that the erasure was designed to prevent. They are remembering. Sleep well. Expanded section. The mystery as community. One thing that deserves acknowledgement before this video ends is the role the fan community has played in keeping this mystery alive and meaningful. Games Workshop created the absence. Priestley left the numbers blank. The Horus Heresy authors scattered the breadcrumbs. But the community did the work of gathering those breadcrumbs, of sitting with them and turning them over, and building theories, and revising those theories, and finding new fragments, and integrating them into updated frameworks. This is not a small thing. The Lost Primarch's mystery has persisted as an active, generative topic of discussion for more than 30 years. Not as a dead historical question that scholars occasionally revisit, as a living discussion that new people enter every day, bringing new perspectives and new ways of reading the existing evidence and sometimes finding things that everyone else missed. The community found the significance of the redaction bar lengths. The community traced the numerical implications of legion-sized data across the various novels. The community noticed that Sanguinius's fear was specifically about a third empty plinth, and worked out what that implied about how the other Primarchs understood the Lost One's fates. The community built the framework for understanding the Rangdan Xenocide's connection long before any single official source confirmed it explicitly. This is what good mysteries do when they are embedded in settings rich enough to support the work of interpretation. They become collaborative. They become a reason for people to read more carefully, to think more rigorously, to share what they have found with others who are trying to figure out the same thing. They create community around the act of sustained attention. The Lost Primarchs created a community of people who care deeply about what is not there, who have developed genuine emotional investment in two beings who have no names, no faces, no confirmed deeds, no story. Who would feel, if Games Workshop finally answered the question definitively, both the satisfaction of resolution and the grief of losing something that had been theirs for so long? The mystery was a shared possession, a collaborative ownership of an unanswered question. The answer would belong to Games Workshop. The question, for all these years, belonged to everyone. That is the final thing the empty pedestals mean. They are a space that belongs to the audience, a space that the setting's creators deliberately left open, and that the audience has, over 3 decades, filled with thought and care and genuine imaginative investment. Whatever the actual truth is, locked away in some design decision that may or may not ever be formalized into canon, the truth that the community has built in its place is real in its own way. It is the truth of what the mystery meant to the people who sat with it. And that truth, at least, cannot be erased. There is a particular kind of reader and viewer and listener who is drawn to this kind of content. Someone who does not just want to consume information, but to sit inside it for a while. Someone who finds value in questions that cannot be answered cleanly, who prefers the weight of an unresolved mystery to the lightness of a solved one. Someone who understands that some of the most important things in any story are the things the story cannot bring itself to say. If you are that person, you know who you are, and you know why videos like this one exist. Not to give you answers, but to give you better questions, to send you back to the source material with new eyes, to make the empty pedestals feel heavier and more significant the next time you encounter them, to make the redacted names in the tables feel like a wound rather than a design choice. That is all this is, an attempt to make the absence feel present, to trace the outline of something that was deliberately made traceless, to insist, against 10,000 years of institutional effort, that the question is still worth asking. It is. It always will be.